Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the virtual Marion Miner Cook Athenaeum. My name is Nandini, and I'm one of your Athenaeum Fellows for this year. Called to action by former President Trump, the world witnessed the unimaginable on January 6th. A mob attacked the United States Capitol in a failed attempt to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. The riot caused the evacuation and lockdown of the Capitol and, tragically, 5 deaths. There were also improvised explosive devices found near Capitol grounds, the DNC office, and the RNC office. Opinion polls suggest that a large majority of Americans disapproved of the storming of the Capitol. The insurgency led the House of Representatives to send their second set of impeachment articles to the Senate, the arrest of over 179 rioters, the resignation of several Trump administration officials, the suspension of Capitol police officers on suspicion of involvement, and investigations into anti-government paramilitary groups like the Oath Keepers. The aftermath of the riots posed critical questions about the future of American democracy amidst the rising popularity of conspiracy groups like QAnon and open acts of white supremacy. Here to discuss the implications of the violent mob attack on American democracy and to help us further process the events of January 6th are Professors George Thomas, Hilary Appel, and Lily Geismer. Professor Thomas is the Burnett C. Woolford Professor of American Political Institutions and Director of the Salvatori Center for the Study of Individual Freedom in the Modern World at CMC. Professor Thomas specializes in American constitutionalism and American political thought. He has received numerous fellowships from the National Endowment of the Humanities and is a recipient of the Alexander George Award from the American Political Science Association. Professor Appel is the Podlick Family Professor of Government, a George R. Roberts Fellow, and the director of the Keck Center for International and Strategic Studies at CMC. Professor Appel has an expertise in political economy and post-communist transitions. She has published numerous books and articles on the politics of economic reform in Russia and Eastern Europe in leading scholarly journals like World Politics. Professor Appel's most recent book, From Triumph to Crisis, Neoliberal Economic Reform in Post-Communist Countries, was just shortlisted for the 2021 Laura Shannon Prize at the Nanovic Institute of European Affairs. Professor Geismer is an associate professor of history at CMC. Her research and teaching focuses on 20th century political and urban history in the United States with a particular focus on liberalism. She is currently working on a book project titled Doing Good, The Democrats and Neoliberalism from the War on Poverty to the Clinton Foundation, which explores the Democratic Party's promotion of market-based solutions to problems of social inequality. Professor Geismer's work has been supported by the American Council for Learned Societies and the Charles Warren Center at Harvard. The panel will present for 30 minutes before taking questions from the audience. Using the Q&A function, we will accept questions throughout the program to be posed towards the end of the event. Preference will go to students, so when you send a question, please state your affiliation with the college. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording are strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Professors Thomas, Appel, and Geismer to the Athenaeum.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. We organized the panel mostly to explore recent events and really try to think of them in both historical and comparative context. But I want to set it up just a bit. And if we think back, I want to go to the election of 1800, an election you know, probably has been made famous for you by Hamilton, the musical. But the election of 1800 was a bitter contest between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, the sitting president. It's often said to represent the very first peaceful transfer of political power in history. It was a milestone. The party in power, the Federalists, relinquished power to the opposition Republicans. Divisions ran deep in 1800, probably as deep as they do today. And yet, it was also a time to point out what we had in common. As Thomas Jefferson would note in his his inaugural address, a few days after taking the presidency, he would say that we're all Federalists and we're all Republicans, attempting to highlight what we have in common. And so part of what we want to do tonight at the ATH is not just to recognize the divisions, but to also plumb what we have in common in terms of constitutional democracy. But I want to go back to the events of January 6th for a moment. Those events broke the peaceful line, this peaceful transfer of power. Power was transferred in accord with the Constitution, but it was not wholly peaceful. It's early to tell now just what those events mean. I don't think we have a full appreciation of the events. We don't know now at this point whether it's a singular event or whether it portends much deeper threats to American democracy. But before we jump to the discussion, I want to play a clip of the event because I want to have a real sense of what the storming of the Capitol building was actually like. So can we play that clip now?
The police had no chance. The mob marched loudly through the hallowed halls of Congress
USA! USA! USA!
with a message.
We want Trump! We want Trump! We want Trump! We want Trump! This is 2021, y'all. This is insanity.
Some broke into the Senate chamber.
Everybody stay down! Get down!
While others forced a standoff outside the Speaker's lobby. A camera focuses on a gun drawn. Seconds later, a woman is shot dead. For the news, I'm Gabe Gutierrez in Washington.
Right. I want to go back just to think about those events in context, right? So those who stormed the Capitol building were urged on by not just President Trump on January 6th, an hour or so before those events took place, but by other supporters of President Trump. But the story is deeper than what occurred on January 6th. And it's not simply a question, was President Trump engaged in inciting insurrection? Was he, deliberately provoking them to march on the Capitol? I think those are all things that we can actually discuss, but let's situate the context. What was Congress doing at that moment? It's not a coincidence that the storming of the Capitol building occurred on January 6th. Congress was engaged in a constitutional process. That constitutional process was the formal counting of the certified electoral votes from the states that would recognize Joe Biden as the president-elect. They were storming the Capitol building to disrupt that constitutional process. They were storming it from their perspective because, in fact, there was a huge electoral fraud. And so I think this is one of the things that we want to discuss and take seriously, because we have here a number of citizens who think the election was stolen, right? From their perspective, right? They're storming the Capitol building to correct a corrupt process. I think the problem with that narrative, and we want to take it seriously as citizens, is that that process is not just misguided, it's based on a lie. President Trump, since right about the time of the election on November 3rd, has been insisting that the election was fraudulent, that the election was stolen from him, and that he won in a landslide. He has a right to not just contest improperly counted ballots and the like, but he has a right to those sorts of legal remedies. And I want to take the step back because there were over 60 cases brought before federal and state courts. They were brought before federal and state court judges. They were brought by judges that were appointed by Republicans and Democrats. Numerous of the judges who ruled in the cases were appointed by President Trump himself. And in over 60 cases, there was no evidence of any significant electoral fraud that would have altered the election. There were actually very few claims of actual electoral fraud in the first place, and mostly kind of technical arguments about the counting of ballots and the like. And if we think that democracy is facing internal pressure and division, as we haven't seen in years, I want to pause also to note a high point here. The law held, and it held in outstanding ways, and it was a tribute to Democrats and Republicans, Obama judges and Trump judges. It was a tribute to Chief Justice John Roberts' insistence that there really, when it comes to the American judiciary, aren't things like Obama judges and Trump judges. There are judges who are doing their best to follow the law, and that's what held in this case. And I want to read a very brief excerpt from an opinion by the Third Circuit distinguished jurist, Judge Stefanos Bibas, himself appointed by President Trump. And he wrote, "Free, fair elections are the lifeblood of our democracy. Charges of unfairness are serious, but calling an election unfair does not make it so. Charges require specific allegations and then proof. We have neither here." This has been the case in the 60 plus cases brought. There was simply no proof of fraud or wrongdoing, and yet President Trump and many of his associates insisted upon this lie. I'm sorry, I know there are those of you who think the election was fraudulent. I'm willing to go over all of the cases and discuss all of the evidence, but I would point back to Stefano Bibas's opinion, where he says there is simply no evidence of that. And to the degree that there's no evidence of that, right, we have a number of Americans who are being profoundly misled, right, who have a growing distrust of the electoral system and are rightly angry, are rightly upset because they think the election was stolen. And I think that's what we want to start to put in perspective tonight, because as more and more Americans think that the electoral system itself is fraudulent, think that the electoral system is somehow stacked in ways that don't count their votes, we're undermining our faith in American democracy. And I want to, not just think of this in terms of the current constitutional moment, but put America in some historical and comparative perspective. And when we think of what's going on in America right now, we often tell ourselves, well, this could never happen in America. Somehow we tend to think that democracy in America is secure because we've always had democracy in America. And I don't think that that's right. It's not just that this could happen in America. This did happen in America. This happened less than a month ago in America. And I think the risk already is that we're underplaying the importance of this event. We're underplaying what this could mean for the future of American democracy. Right now, there's no question. It belongs to a single president who's uniquely situated in American history. But for those of you who might be supporters of President Trump or voted for President Trump, but then are not bothered by the lies or the potential attack on the Congress as it was engaged in its constitutional responsibilities, I guess the question we need to wrestle with is, why do we think it will be contained there? Why don't we think that there are also those on the left side of the political spectrum who will see what's going on and think that they too in the future can challenge and contest close electoral victories, can try to pressure elected officials within the states to push a few votes this way or that way, who will threaten members of Congress in order to get them not to count electoral votes? I mean, that is all opening the door to a corruption of the electoral process and the not just the peaceful transfer of power itself, but really the future of American constitutional democracy. And so while we mostly want to leave time for your questions and work through these issues together, I wanted to invite my colleagues to enter the discussion. And I wanted to turn to Professor Geismer first to give us a little bit of historical perspective on recent events.
Thanks so much. And I just want to thank George for organizing the panel and for inviting me to serve on it. In the aftermath of the events of January 6th, there's been a calling on historians for guidance. This is both exciting for historians who often feel irrelevant, but what often when people ask what they want from historians, this is especially the media, is an effort to find a sort of single precedent or event that can provide a playbook or at least comfort in what transpired. It's become pretty clear pretty quickly, as often is the case with these kind of exercises, that there's no exact precedent that we can look to. So rather than looking for a single moment or event, it's more valuable to examine the historical processes which made the insurrection possible. In my brief time, I'll talk about a couple of examples of processes that relate in direct and indirect ways to tonight's focus on this question around democracy. First, the Civil War and Reconstruction era is particularly instructive in reminding us that there's been a long tradition of ignoring the procedures established by the Constitution. When Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, political leaders from South Carolina refused to accept the results, fearing that the Lincoln presidency would lead to the weakening of Southern political power and ultimately to the elimination of slavery. 10 other Southern states later joined in, rejecting the election's outcome and declaring that they intended to form a nation of their own, the Confederacy, with the main objective of protecting and extending the institution of slavery. And it's this action that, of course, spawned the Civil War. During the Reconstruction era, there were also countless efforts to overturn extra-legally the results of democratic elections. In 1873, armed whites seized control of the local government of Colfax, Louisiana, from elected Black officials. An uprising the following year sought to overthrow the biracial Reconstruction government of that entire state. In 1898, in a coup that's been looked at a lot recently, armed whites in Wilmington, North Carolina, ousted the elected biracial fusionist local government. In the process, killed over 60 people. These violent efforts worked hand in hand with less violent, but no less politically harmful actions that enabled a retaking of the Southern state government by white supremacist officials who formalized the Jim Crow system, rewrote Southern state constitutions in ways that deliberately disenfranchised immense swaths of the Black population. And I think it's important. These actions were not just happening in the South in the late 19th and early 20th much of the 20th century. Through a combination of violence and laws, there was an effective excluding of large swaths of the public from political processes. And it wasn't really until a mass movement building for over 70 years that African Americans gained democratic rights. The Voting Rights Act was one of the signal achievements of the civil rights movement, but it's been contested and curtailed basically since its passage. And I think that's one thing that, to build on something that George said about about democratic institutions, that we often think of this, so there's a lot of discussion about sort of the United States as being the world's oldest liberal democracy, but it's never really been a full democracy. I mean, at least up until 1965, and most people would argue after, where you have full enfranchisement. A second process I saw on display on January 6th, and I think was really clear in the video as well, is a declining faith in the institutions and of government. So an anti-government ethos is a dominant strain in American history, and you can see it on both the left and the right, but it really took on new proportions in the 1960s. One of the things, sort of faith in government, is one of the most important legacies of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. But the combination of the Vietnam War, where Americans rightfully believed that Lyndon Johnson was lying to them about what was going on, coupled with Watergate and the recessions of the 1970s, shattered that belief. This is something I often explain to my students, that's actually one of the things that's really different about the period when you look at the kind of the 30s to the 60s of American history, is this faith in government, and that's something that has really disappeared. This ethos played a critical role in bolstering the fortunes of Ronald Reagan, who framed his entire political career and worldview around the idea that the federal government was a threat to freedom and individual liberty. This is perhaps best captured in one of his most sort of famous stock phrases, which was the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." He also famously, in his 1981 inaugural address, declared that government is not the solution to the problem, government is the problem. And in many ways, Reagan saw the role of the president as to protect the people from encroachment by Congress and other branches of government. This message increasingly became not exclusive to Reagan and the Republicans, but had a lot of bipartisan currency, especially in the last decades of the 20th century. It was Democrat Bill Clinton who famously declared that the era of big government is over in 1996. And one of the things that this is sort of coincided with is the percentage of Americans who believe that public officials care what they think and are looking out for their best interests has just continued to decline precipitously. And it's become especially true in marginalized communities. I would say to me, a really revealing poll came out last year, pre-election and pre-pandemic, that found that 75% of Americans say that their fellow citizens' trust in the federal government has been shrinking, and 64% feel that about people's trust in one another. What to me makes this anti-government sentiment especially disturbing is that in the moment of the pandemic and the interlocking health, economic, and social crises that it has produced, it is clear that the resources and the power of the federal government are in very high demand, and so too is its ability to function and be trusted. To make a final point, and this builds another thing that George was talking about, in the immediate aftermath of the insurrection, Joe Biden declared in his speech, sort of commenting on it, "This is not who we are." So this is a nice aspiration, especially for Biden, who is staking his credibility on a message of unity and building consensus. But that interpretation of the past and the present erases huge swaths of American history. As many of you know who've taken an American history, sort of a basic American history class, or even just listened to what I've been talking about, violence, white supremacy, and efforts to limit and undermine democracy are fundamental parts of who we are. Coming to terms with that history and not treating it as an aberration will offer really important steps in finding ways to strengthen the United States' democratic institutions and rule of law. Thank you.
So Hilary, can we now turn to you for a little bit of a comparative perspective?
Certainly, absolutely. And thank you for including me in this panel and giving me the chance to offer a comparative perspective, a comparativist who's looking at these events. I want us to take what Professor Thomas said very seriously, that something very important has happened not even a month ago, and I don't want us to be distracted by the new news cycles on GameStop or whatever, stories that are occupying our attention, because something very significant has recently happened, and it's something that we have to contend with. Our democracy faced the risk of collapse. And I think we cannot treat this lightly. We need to pause and think very seriously about the vulnerability of our democracy, because in fact, the US system should have anticipated better the problem that even democratically elected presidents don't want to relinquish power. Now, some democracies around the world have been designed by people who were less fearful of the concentration of power. I think what comes to mind for me is France's Fifth Republic, that was designed with institutions and a strong presidency because it was a reaction against France's inability to deal with challenges in the Fourth Republic, like decolonization. Or we can think about other kinds of democracies like the Westminster model that evolved in a way to avoid gridlock by putting so much power in the parliament with parliamentary sovereignty. But the US system is very much based on this idea that Americans abhor the concentration of power, and that a lot of institutions were created in order to protect against self-aggrandizement. That's when leaders come to power and then use the power of their office to prevent political turnover at the end of their terms. Now, there are institutions in the United States to protect against the concentration of power. For example, our system of federalism with strong states' rights, the democratic system with checks and balances distributed among the branches of government, a strong and vigilant civil society, and importantly, an independent and free media and democratic norms. Now, given all these institutions, and given that there was such intentionality in trying to prevent the concentration of power and to enable peaceful political turnover, why was our democracy on the brink of collapse? Why am I saying to you that we must not move our attention to the next distraction, that we need to pay attention to what's happened here? Well, there are really 2 points I'd want to make then as to why the integrity of our electoral process is in question and why democracy has been so vulnerable. Well, first is that the president, as we've all been discussing, leading up into the elections and the day of the elections and since the elections was intent on challenging the integrity of this process. And he was able to convince and mobilize a lot of American citizens that fraud would occur and that fraud did occur. And if you look around the world in recent history, it turns out that electoral fraud is a very effective mobilizing strategy, and not just in democracies. I mean, you could look at the examples from the post-communist world that I study, the colored revolutions, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004 and 2005, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan in 2003, the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2005. You think even about what's happening in Belarus. These are mass mobilizations that occur around the fear that elections were fraudulent. They do bring people to the streets. And we know that as a result of this mass mobilization around their outrage surrounding a stolen election, that ultimately led to the collapse of these existing regimes. So, this fear of mass mobilization around fraudulent elections is the reason why President Putin is very careful to make sure that his elections appear legitimate to the population, because he also fears the emergence of a colored revolution in his own country, facilitated by well-wishers abroad who want to support democratic movements through encouraging the universal embrace of democracy and democratic norms. So leaders all over the world are afraid of holding elections that are not sufficiently credible, not sufficiently believable, because they know it brings people to the streets. So the United States is experiencing its own version of this. And clearly, this has been made possible through the president's ability to sow distrust through direct appeals to his constituents using sympathetic media and also direct media, specifically social media. And this is a new problem for us to deal with. So that leads me to the second problem of why I consider us to be in such dangerous times for the stability of our democracy. This concerns the flow of information. Americans have become more tribal and more insular, all the more during a pandemic, certainly, and less exposed to alternative perspectives. Now, in terms of important US democratic institutions, the free media should guard against this or help alleviate this. But in fact, it has not met the challenge, unfortunately. So yes, we do have a free media, we do have an independent media, but we've gotten into some bad habits of self-censorship in this country. Now, self-censorship, not so much in what we're willing to say ourselves, but to whom we're willing to say it, right? We surround ourselves with people with like-minded ideas that we can share these perspectives with because we want others to agree with us. But there's another aspect of this that worries me, unfortunately, even more, which is that we've censored our access to a variety of perspectives, and we censor our own information by limiting the information we receive. So many of my students, I tell them, I know you're relying on news feeds to receive your information, but unfortunately, those news feeds will only send you the information that reinforces your beliefs based on algorithms that have detected certain ideological bents that you have. It's so important for us to figure out ways to not live in this echo chamber in democracy, because these algorithms feed us what we want to hear, but not necessarily the facts on the ground. So this really leads me to this concern that social media has outpaced democratic safeguards and democratic institutions, and we need to catch up. It's false or inadequate to think that banning President Trump's social media accounts will prevent the narrative of a stolen election from circulating. I mean, you can also ban Parler, except that the Russians are trying to help support this far-right conspiracy discussion board by hosting it on Russian servers, right? So it's not that it's going to be that easy to prevent information that incites violence and that sows distrust in our political system. Controlling the narrative is important for democratic regimes as it is for authoritarian regimes. And authoritarian regimes are quite masterful at doing it, right? Their survival depends upon it. You can think China, you can think Russia, not to mention Iran, Venezuela, Syria, Belarus. Social media has become the censorship because of the way it works. As citizens, we're living in parallel universes, and a president can mobilize citizens around election fraud or other issues. And we may not have yet developed the institutions to counter this, allowing for self-aggrandizement and a refusal of leaders to relinquish power. Now, thinking about this in comparative perspective, what depresses me is that this set of events has meant that the US has lost soft power around the world. Now, this could be its own set of remarks, but certainly for those of you who follow the foreign press, you know that authoritarian leaders around the world were gloating. They were relishing in our faltering democracy, and the remarks by the Chinese state news agency or leaders in Russia, even if not coming from Presidents Xi and Putin, represented this great pleasure, I would say, in the US laying bare its own weaknesses and its own vulnerabilities. And although this doesn't feel great for others to enjoy our humiliation, I would just say what is more important to me is that it does not bode well for this magnetic appeal of democracy around the world. And I do feel that the United States, despite the fact that it has so many flaws, despite the fact that we are still aspiring to a truly free and equal political system that respects the rule of law for all citizens, despite these aspirations are not always realized for all citizens, and nonetheless has been an important model for democratic activists around the world and for those who aspire to such a political system. So that is one of my greatest regrets about these events, not only what it means for our faith in democracy at home, but for the faith in democracy in countries around the world. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you both, Professor Appel and Professor Geismer. So I think we should just open it up to questions now, as that's really why we gathered together.
All right, thank you, Professors Thomas, Geismer, and Appel. The first question comes from a student that asks, what, in your opinions, are the steps that ensuing presidents, their cabinets, and governments as a whole need to take to restore faith in democracy as an institution? Beyond the elections themselves, what are tangible resolutions to gridlock, ineffectiveness, and polarization that any administration, regardless of party, can implement?
Do you want to start, Lily, with that or not?
It's a great question, and I mean, I think that one of the, at the basic level is that and I mentioned this, but the real sort of evisceration of the Voting Rights Act has, and some of the sort of the oversight of it has led to a lot of a variety of different tactics like gerrymandering and real voter restriction that has led to a lot of enfranchisement. I think actually one of the things that was powerful about the 2020 election is that there was huge voter turnout, but that was overcoming insurmountable odds. And I think that an effort to make the system fair, to live up to what things like the 1965 Voting Rights Act did and expand it are really powerful steps that need to be taken. And that's something that both has to happen at the federal government level, but I think also at the state level too. And it's another step. I think another really powerful thing, with gridlock, and it's an interesting moment where we feel, I will speak, this is not in my historical role just as my role as a citizen, both sort of incredibly optimistic and pessimistic. That there are some of these things that have happened from the election have been powerful, but I think another thing that will be really important is either reforming or eliminating the filibuster. I think a lot of the sort of some of these sort of mechanisms that were put in place a very long time ago no longer serve their purpose and are not allowing our democratic institutions to do what they're supposed to do. And those are two that I will throw out there, but I'm happy to open it up to everyone. I'm sure that Professor Thomas and Professor Appel have others.
Yeah, I would second those. The other thing, I guess to pause on things that went really well. When you think of an election during a pandemic, with potential foreign threats as well as happened in 2016, as well as just the extraordinary turnout we saw in 2020, the election came off remarkably well. There were no real glitches. Yeah, there are issues here and there, but when you think of that part of it, I mean, that part of it was extraordinarily successful given the circumstances. And so we can focus on some of the positives. The other thing I guess I would, maybe try to highlight in the short term, just thinking forward, I actually think if you could get some, effective legislation on issues that most Americans overwhelmingly care about, that would be a small step to actually not just kind of restoring faith in the democratic process a bit, but actually kind of getting beyond some of the things that divide us so much. Because when you think of pandemic relief, there's just a large area where there's ready agreement. And if we could have some success there, I really think that can get us beyond some of the political divisions. And these are issues where there's not really a huge political divide. And so I think, I guess one of the things I would focus on, both, if I were a Republican in the House or the Senate, or if I'm President Biden, would be looking for those kinds of small victories. But I think those kind of small victories could be really helpful to kind of putting some of the divisiveness behind us, even while I'm, the one here insisting, look, we can't just brush over what happened on January 6th at all. Professor Appel, do you have any thoughts on that one, or do you want to?
Well, I want us to dwell
Okay.
on January 6th, not on this question necessarily, but on January 6th. I don't want us to move on too quickly. So even though, we can focus on what has been successful, and ultimately we can say, it's successful that it wasn't a bloodbath, right? Because often it's the way a government responds that exacerbates these tensions and that creates even more difficulty. In some ways, you can focus on the success of an election being held during the pandemic, the fact that we did have the inauguration, that we did have that we did have a turnover in leadership ultimately. So in the end, the institutions protected the democracy. It's just that we came so close. We came so close to things going in a very different and very discouraging direction. So, I don't want to be all pessimism, though it's very easy for me at this moment to do that, because I want to say that what has, besides smaller things and looking for common ground and institutional changes, what I would say to what I hope are a lot of students in this audience, and was how just gratified I was talking to my students in November, finding out just how many of them were civically engaged. And anything that could be done to get young people engaged and deeply involved in our political process, who feel close to these values and norms, that is a very encouraging possibility, I think, for the future of democracy. And when I saw that it was nearly every student in my class was somehow involved in some campaign or in canvassing or in voter turnout movements, it was really heartening, and it gave me hope that this is not just what's more of to come, but really what's more of, what's possible still in terms of the health of our political system.
How could we codify a better process to peacefully challenge results if such challenges are becoming more common?
I guess I'll jump on that one. And when we say, I guess I don't totally understand the question in terms of peacefully challenge results, because one of the things that was, again, think of the highlights of the system. There were, to contest election results within the court system was, open, and the courts actually, in many cases, bent over backwards to entertain claims that they probably could have dismissed early. But I think it was appropriate for them to indulge such claims, just to say, look, we want to take even what looks like, not a totally plausible claim seriously, so we can give it a full airing. The court system, the law, was extraordinary in that case. When you think there were at least 64 cases brought challenging different things, and there were just no evidence of that. And again, across political divide and the like. So that part of it, if the challenge is more, I think where there were issues, and where we really haven't had anything like this before, is where there were attempts to challenge the electors in states and the like, or the state certification of ballots. And that's a process. That's a much more complex process and a problematic one. And I mean, I think what occurred there on the one hand, it's the good things, right? I mean, you did actually have contested ballots. You had recounts. You had 3 recounts in Georgia. You had recounts in Pennsylvania. That all went extraordinarily well, and all of the civil servants engaged were really honorable civil servants. What it also showed are a few weak points, right, where the process is actually really a formality, where the canvassing board is not really deciding anything, it's simply moving the votes along. But suddenly there were those who like, well, what if we're going to vote against it just because we don't like the result? And for instance, Arizona right now is flirting with actually giving the legislature the power to choose the electors under state law, even if the voters go the other way. I mean, so those kinds of things, I mean, those are, I guess I'll plug an upcoming act. There's an election law expert coming, I think, next week, who's really wants to address all of these questions. And it's really trying to just, address how can Americans as a whole have faith in their electoral process.
What role does education play in this problem? How do we approach the future with facts in our media and in our teaching of national history to promote unity and prevent this division and extremism from gaining traction or ever happening again?
I think one of the problems, I mean, the study of history has always been really politicized in incredibly detrimental ways. And I don't know if necessarily we always want sort of a unified history. I mean, the interpretations of history are often contested, but I think ones that are sort of rooted in facts and evidence are really powerful. And I think there's been a large scale. I mean, this is a bigger thing about. I joked about historians being irrelevant. I actually think one thing that's happened in the last 5 years, there's been more attention to history, but at the same time, there's been a decline in kind of in the kind of investment in the humanities. And I think this is actually a really big concern from what's going to happen to institutions post-pandemic. I mean, is this kind of discrediting of humanities-based schooling at all levels. So that's something to actually be really careful and look to. I actually will say one thing. I always tell this when I'm on airplanes, but I think we do need to have much more of a kind of discussion of civics and basic sort of understandings of government and democracy at all levels of education. So when I used to travel pre-pandemic on airplanes, when I told people what I do, they always would ask me, "What is the Electoral College?" And I think it's a really sort of powerful example of the kind of lack of understanding of basic sort of functions of our system, and that I think there just needs to be some of that at all stages of education.
I do wonder whether the Electoral College leads us, in some ways vulnerable to moving further away from direct democracy of citizens electing their leaders. So of course, when you have some expectation of who would benefit from getting rid of the Electoral College, like California, there's going to be pretty clear reasons and for others to mobilize against it. But I'll tell you, I have to laugh when it's the Russian foreign ministry that makes a statement that the reason for our troubles is, and this is a quote, "The electoral system in the United States is archaic. It does not meet modern democratic standards." And the United States, the US media have become an instrument of the political struggle. When you have the Russian foreign ministry saying the problem is our Electoral College, I mean, it gives me pause. I have to think about, it's starting to be a little bit too obvious that if states can use this as an excuse not to use the Electoral College to directly determine, based on the votes, who is then elected by that state, that's a disaster waiting to happen in my mind.
Let me, pushing the Electoral College to the side, that's a really big discussion on its own, just to think about the education part of it. I partly want to second much of what Professor Geismer said, and going not just in college, but going back, especially to secondary education, where we've been, and this is something that is, again, kind of united across the political spectrum, this insistence on STEM and tech in a way, and it's often come at the expense of history and civics. And I think, if anything, the last several years have shown the importance of history. I mean, we don't have a great historical understanding as a people. When it comes to basic civics, it's something close to 50% of Americans can't simply name the three branches of government, let alone know really how the Electoral College functions. And I mean, that creates its own kind of alienation from the system. So I think we really need to redouble our efforts there. And I even plug that, as CMC's, talking science and quantitative analysis and the like, as important as all that is, I think, history and basic civics remains absolutely essential if education is going to support some form of liberal democratic government.
How do you all see America reckoning with the events of January 6th as a white supremacist insurrection and the contrast in reactions by the police to this incident compared to those of the summer?
Well, this is a very tough situation. I think about how a lot of social media coverage of this on especially young people's social media accounts very much focused on the contrast between the very significant police presence in the BLM protests over the summer relative to what happened at the Capitol. In fact, those things are related. We know that. We know that the mayor of Washington, D.C. was worried about calling in the feds. They made bad choices. There was certainly bad decisions made in terms of security at the Capitol. That's without a question, but one is a little bit of reaction to the other. At the same time, probably this is not, cannot in any way be fully explained by trying to keep the military, sorry, well, it wouldn't be the military, but sort of to bring in the police and the National Guard at the right point to protect them. I mean, I think there was probably some blind spots, right? And thinking about these people were not a threat, despite the fact that there was so much information online. This was not, this was predictable. This was planned in a very open forum. There was no reason why there shouldn't have been information collected on this, but there seems to have been a blind spot that is related to race. And this is something that we have to deal with, and we have to contend with, who do we see as a threat in this country, and why was it responded to and anticipated very differently in one set of protests versus another?
Yeah, I would second that. I mean, I think it's absolutely embedded. The racialization is absolutely embedded in the way in the reaction to both kinds of protesters and the long history of police targeting communities of color and protesters of color. And you can see that, I mean, in the differences of different kinds of protests that have occurred at even in spaces of government over the years. I'd also say, actually, another thing than asking of sort of how to challenge democratic institutions that is a minor point, but is related, is the question of DC statehood as another thing that can kind of, when we think about how to kind of change certain kinds of democratic institutions. But the fact that the mayor of DC has very little power and is controlled in large parts by Congress, I mean, in a way that I'm not advocating that bringing in the National Guard in all situations is effective or the right thing to do, but that is easily mobilized by a state than it is by the way that the complicated way that DC is set up. So I think that there are places that on a multiple levels, actually, DC state has another thing. I don't think it's going to be the first priority of the next year, but it's something that to sort of be thinking about. But I think I think that's another thing of not dwelling on what happened. And I think looking at those images, it is absolutely fundamental that what was shown in just even the clip that Professor Thomas showed is absolutely deeply tied to structures of race.
Next question. Could each of you, and particularly Professor Geismer, speak to the media content bubbles we deal with in regard to how different sides perceived the events of January 6th?
Sure. I think, Professor Appel, I think, spoke of this with the kind of one of the kinds of transformation. When we think about, historians think about sort of continuity and change. And I think that one of the questions that's happened is the way that the changing nature of media has amplified certain patterns. And I think that that's been a huge set of questions in the ways that, we talked about this, that we sort of think about the press is playing a critical role in democracies, and that's sort of one of its sort of fundamental institutions, and why we have freedom of the press. But that has been so subverted in the ways that we've had this fracturing of media, and that you only sort of hear certain realities. It's really heightened and undergirded political polarization. And I think that it's a hard question. I think this is something that Professor Thomas brought up at the beginning, that the ways in which certain kinds of media, particularly on the kind of the right end of the political spectrum, have created a reality that you can sort of, and that's where you sort of empathize at some level with certain people, that there's a message relentlessly said that this was a stolen election. And so, like, what are the actions you take if an election is stolen? And I do think that that's not just kind of coming out of out of nowhere. That has been supported by certain kind of this kind of fractured media environment.
And really quickly on that, it's a small thing, but one of the things I think that we can all do as individuals to actually kind of, break some of these barriers down is to actually try to read some media that is not going to readily agree with you. Now, I mean, when, there's no question, like, okay, so the New York Times or the Washington Post certainly has, a slight liberal bias, I would say, on their editorial pages. The news content you get from there is just extraordinary still, and still remains really genuine reporting. But I think too often we're actually not doing news as news anymore, and we all turn to like opinions that kind of sift the news for us, and then we turn to the opinions we more or less want to hear. And I think that's one of the things that really kind of keeps us in our bubble and lets us just kind of confirm what we already think. And so, as I guess to students especially, there are just all kinds of, excellent columnists on the left side of the political spectrum, on the right side of the political spectrum. You should actually make an effort to read, things that you disagree with from those people, to push yourself, but also to, be aware of the other perspectives that are out there.
There was talk surrounding the 25th Amendment when President Trump was in office, and now we're hearing a lot about the impeachment. So what guidance does the Constitution give about dealing with the events that unfolded on January 6th?
Well, I guess I'll try to be really quick on that so we can have a few more questions. I mean, the 25th Amendment talk. The 25th Amendment is really it's passed after John F. Kennedy's assassination, and the 25th Amendment is really meant to deal with a president who becomes incapacitated in some manner, and has a section. It not only gives you kind of a clear line of the order of who steps into the office, should the president die, but then it also allows the vice president and the cabinet to essentially trigger the removal of the president should the president be deemed incapacitated. My sense is that, yes, while there were flirtations with the 25th Amendment, and there was a move to push the 25th Amendment, especially from Congress before they moved on impeachment, I actually don't think it was the proper remedy. And I actually think if you look at Vice President Pence's memo explaining why he would not invoke the 25th Amendment, he explained because he did not think that President Trump was mentally incapacitated in any ways. And so he thought that wasn't the appropriate remedy. I don't think it was. I think the appropriate remedy was impeachment by way of Congress. And, Congress could have moved very quickly on this. I mean, this is, to me, the most self-evident case for an offense that's impeachable that we've ever had in historical terms. The Constitution is actually really simple in terms of how it sets it out. The House has the sole power of impeachment. The Senate has the sole power to try all impeachments. The only wrinkle there is that the Senate can then, in addition to removing someone from office, and this is the second part of it, is why you're still going to have a trial. The Senate can also, should it find the officer guilty of the offense, the Senate can vote to not allow that person to hold an office of public trust in the future. And so I think that is the proper remedy, and it's really a matter of congressional will, and Congress has been deeply reluctant. And one of the things I would say has been true across administrations, and is one of the things that's actually led to some of the discontent we have with democracy in America, is Congress has abdicated over time more and more of its responsibilities to the presidency and to the courts. And Congress has done that through Republican presidents and through Democratic presidents. And this has been an instance where Congress could have seized back very clearly power that belonged to it. I mean, it was the institution attacked formally in this case, carrying out its constitutional duties. And even then, it's been hesitant to exercise this power that it very clearly has.
Please comment on why we should continue to rely on a hugely biased system of an electoral college instead of the popular vote, which most Americans actually understand.
I mean, I'll just say quickly, I think that that this goes to the other question. I mean, I do think that the Electoral College has played a role in undermining many people's faith in the democratic system. And I'm curious, actually, I think Professor Appel might have said this in her comment, but that I wonder actually going forward if that will happen even more. I mean, this last election has been one that even more clearly has shown some of the, I mean, this is it's a deeply archaic system, but one that, given the other parts of our functions of government, seem to not be going away. There is I mean, there are moves to kind of to take steps to limit it, this might be the moment in which that will happen. So that's, if ever there was a will to do it, it might be right now.
Do you have anything on that, Hilary?
Well, I don't think we should waste this crisis. Right? I think we should take the opportunity to think about certain institutions that, undermine our faith in the democratic system and see what can be done about it. But you both as Americanists know better what stands in the way than I do in terms of making this a reality. But you have to think about how big does the shock have to be to our political system to actually have significant institutional change. If this can't do it, then I don't know what it would take.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be the skeptic. I don't think you're going to get electoral college reform anytime in the immediate future. And I mean, I would give it not so much a defense, but maybe a little bit of a moderate one. It's in this. It's not clear to me that in a huge country marked with divisions, that just a straight up popular vote is the only way to reform, right? I mean, there might be reasons for having, taking other interests into account. That, I mean, the electoral college system that was originally designed worked, as it was supposed to work about twice, and actually made a little bit of sense early on when we actually did not have elections as we now have elections. That's something that's been a historical development, and it works, wildly different than it was intended. And right now it does really distort political power in that way. So that's not the defense I would give it. But I mean, when we think about institutional reform, which I think I'm all with Professor Appel on, I mean, you can have great admiration for our constitutional system and still acknowledge that it needs some institutional reforms. I mean, I think Congress has not really worked how we envisioned Congress working for much of the second half of the 20th century, and we need to think about the kinds of innovations and reforms we could have that are consistent with actually maintaining the Constitution. And we should think of electoral college reform along those lines. I would just say a straight up kind of plebiscitary vote on the president is unlikely to succeed. And so maybe we can think of other ways to do it.
You see, the thing is that I'm used to studying countries around the world that have undertaken absolutely dramatic transformations of their political institutions. So the realm of the possible for me is much broader than it would be for an Americanist, who would certainly see that we have a stability or a stultification of our political system. So for me, I don't see changes at the margin. I see, absolute transformation of fundamental economic, political, and social institutions. So I see that it's possible, but that doesn't mean I don't recognize there are stakeholders, there are interests, there are many who have a lot to lose from any kind of change, and they can organize and prevent change from happening.
And in fairness on that point, actually, the things we think are impossible sometimes in the end happen much more quickly than we think. So, that could actually happen.
That's right. I don't think any of us who have been following American politics for as long as the three of us would have ever guessed we would have had such, rapid cultural shifts in terms of LGBTQ rights in this country, serving in the military. I mean, when I have had to explain to students that, this is something that we watched in real time, that for us is an extraordinary development that seems almost inconceivable, or decriminalization of marijuana, or things that happen so fast that those of us growing up in a different era find mind-boggling. So yes, sometimes change happens very quickly. Sometimes regimes fall, sometimes institutions change. But yes, it's not easy in this country, that's for sure.
Unfortunately, we could not get to all of the questions in the Q&A function, but before we conclude, does the panel have any parting thoughts for our audience?
Just thank you for being here in large numbers today. I'm glad to see that our students are engaged and our community is engaged. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say, especially to the students in the audience, just briefly, that I mean, the one thing, I mean, why you should focus on January 6th is, I mean, it's not just that the event was disturbing, but I think in America, we're too content thinking that somehow we're, other countries succumb to democratic decay, other countries, have democracies that go awry, but somehow we tend to think that in America, we're immune to those sorts of laws or happenings. And I think that that's just wrong. I think we understand America better, first of all, when we put it in comparative perspective. But the idea that democracy is something that just, has an inexorable force of its own, or as the, famous poet and diplomat James Russell Lowe said, it's a machine that would go of itself, is just wrong. And incidentally, Lowe said that in trying to say it's not a machine that would go of itself. Democratic decay is on the horizon, and this was in the late 19th century, and that's something we ought to take seriously. And so to the students, I would think it's really kind of your generation that also is going to engage in the process of carrying democracy forward, and you should take that task seriously.
I have nothing as rousing as those comments, so I will just say thank you. But I do think that the importance of thinking about this comparatively is really powerful. And just to second that, that it's the dangers of American exceptionalism can happen time and time again, and it's really important to sort of not take an attitude of like, this is not who we are, or some of that kind of language, and actually sort of fundamentally grapple with what is in American history. And I think the other part of that is that there's lots of alternative paths that haven't been taken that have lots of democratic possibility to them, and those can be really important too.
On behalf of Claremont McKenna College and the Athenaeum, thank you all for joining us tonight. A special thanks to Professors Thomas, Appel, and Geismer, and to all of those who sent in questions. Don't forget to join us for our next virtual Ath event, which will be this Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific. Graham Lee Brewer will be speaking on how American journalism has created and sustained national myths about Indigenous people. Thank you all and have a great evening.